My name is Eleanor Chen Mills, and I am writing this in 1976 because 3 women are dead and I should have been the fourth. 23 years ago, I married a man who kept a leather journal filled with detailed instructions on how to murder wives. The journal contained photographs of bruised women and clinical notes about which bones break most quietly. I found this journal hidden in our basement, which is why I am alive today to write these words while Robert Sullivan rots in Stateville Penitentiary serving 6 life sentences for murder. The reason I am telling you this story is simple. Other women need to know that when a man isolates you from friends, controls your money, and hits you while claiming it proves his love, he is following a pattern that ends in death. I survived because I learned to document evidence, because I stopped believing his lies, and because I fought back with a cast-iron skillet when he tried to strangle me in our kitchen. If you are reading this and recognize these warning signs in your own life, understand this clearly: love never requires you to disappear. In March 1953, I was 25 years old and working as a graphic designer at Henderson & Associates in downtown Chicago. This was unusual for a woman, especially one of mixed Chinese and Irish heritage, but my talent with illustrations had earned me a position creating advertisements for soap companies and cigarette manufacturers. I made $60 a week, which allowed me to rent a studio apartment on the North Side and support myself independently. I had never been married and was not particularly eager to change that situation, despite my mother's frequent suggestions that I was getting too old to be choosy about suitors. My independence was important to me because I had watched my mother struggle in her marriage to my father, an Irish immigrant who drank too much and expected complete obedience from his Chinese wife. My mother had given up her job as a seamstress when she married, making her financially dependent on a man who used that dependence to control every aspect of her life. I had sworn I would never put myself in such a position, which is why I found Robert Sullivan's apparent respect for my career so appealing when we first met. Robert appeared at Miller's Coffee House on a rainy Tuesday evening in March 1953. I was sitting alone sketching portraits of other customers for practice when he approached my table and complimented my work. He was tall, well-dressed, and spoke with the kind of educated accent that suggested good breeding and financial security. He introduced himself as an architect who designed homes where families can build their dreams, and showed me a leather portfolio filled with drawings of beautiful houses. "I build dreams in wood and stone," he said, "while you create them on paper. We understand the same language." This conversation felt different from the awkward interactions I usually had with men who seemed threatened by my career or confused by my mixed heritage. Robert treated my work as legitimate art rather than a hobby I would abandon upon marriage. He asked intelligent questions about my techniques and expressed genuine interest in my artistic goals. When I showed him some of my more ambitious illustrations, images of strong women protecting their children, heroines standing against storms, he praised my skill while gently suggesting I might consider softer subjects that would appeal to a broader audience. "You have real talent, Eleanor," he said, his fingers tracing the lines of my drawings. "But perhaps these women look a bit too..." Independent men want to feel needed by their wives. They want to be heroes in their family's stories. I found myself nodding agreement, though something about his suggestion bothered me in ways I could not articulate. If a successful architect thought my work needed refinement, surely his professional opinion carried more weight than my personal preferences. The courtship that followed was intense and romantic in ways I had never experienced. Robert sent flowers to my office daily, so many that my coworkers began teasing about my mysterious admirer. He appeared at closing time with tickets to symphony performances and reservations at expensive restaurants. He brought me gifts wrapped in silver paper art books, fine brushes, exotic paints that must have cost more than I made in a week. There were warning signs I should have recognized, but Robert's explanations always sounded reasonable. When my friend Martha noticed how he positioned himself between me and other men at parties, he explained that he was protective of what he treasured. When my boss complimented a successful campaign I had designed, Robert interrupted to say, "Eleanor's always been too modest about her little drawings. I keep telling her she has real talent, even if it's just a hobby." The words stung, but Robert kissed my forehead afterward and whispered, "I only say that because I want people to see how special you are without making you seem too ambitious. Men don't like wives who compete with them professionally." My mother disliked Robert immediately when I brought him home to Milwaukee for dinner. After he dominated conversation with stories of his architectural triumphs, she pulled me aside in the kitchen. "There's something calculating in his eyes," she said in Mandarin, a language Robert did not speak. "He watches you like a buyer examining merchandise. And notice how he never asks questions about other people, only talks about himself." But I was tired of lonely evenings and family gatherings where I was the only unmarried woman. Robert promised a future where I could have both love and career, where I could create art while building a family, with someone who understood and appreciated my talents. When he proposed, after 6 months presenting a diamond ring and plans for a wedding at St. Mary's Cathedral, I said yes because I believed I had found the partnership I had always wanted. We married on September 15th, 1953, in a ceremony that felt like a fairy tale. The church was filled with flowers. My grandmother's pearl necklace gleamed at my throat, and Robert's eyes held mine as we exchanged vows, promising to love and protect each other until death. Looking at our wedding photographs now, I can see what my mother noticed, the way his hand grips mine just slightly too tightly, the possessive angle of his body as he shields me from other people's view, the smile that never quite reaches his eyes. But that day, I saw only love and promise. The violence began on our wedding night at the Palmer House Hotel. I was nervous, as any new bride would be, and my hands shook as I poured wine for us to share while we talked about our future together. The glass slipped from my trembling fingers, sending red wine cascading across the white tablecloth and onto Robert's shirt. It was a simple accident, the kind that happens when excitement makes someone clumsy. Robert's face changed instantly. The loving expression I had known for 6 months disappeared, replaced by something cold and predatory. He backhanded me across the face with enough force to knock me to the floor, my wedding tiara scattering pearls across the marble like broken promises. "Look what you've done," he said, his voice deadly calm. "You've ruined our wedding night with your clumsiness. Can't you do anything right?" I wanted to explain that it had been an accident, that I had never meant to cause problems. Instead, I found myself apologizing from my position on the floor, promising to be more careful to be worthy of his love, despite my obvious inadequacy. The taste of blood in my mouth was sharp and metallic, and my cheek throbbed where he had struck me, but I was more confused than angry. This behavior seemed completely unlike the charming man I had married hours earlier. Robert helped me to the bed with gentle hands, the same hands that had just hit me, and spoke softly about loving me so intensely that it sometimes overwhelmed his self-control. "You bring out such passion in me, Eleanor," he whispered. "I love you so much that when you disappoint me, it breaks my heart. Promise you'll help me be the husband you deserve by being more careful." I promised because I loved him, and because the alternative, accepting that I had made a terrible mistake in front of everyone who had celebrated our wedding, was too devastating to consider. The next morning brought breakfast in bed and apologies that seemed genuine. Robert's eyes were red with apparent remorse as he explained that wedding stress had caused him to react poorly to my accident. "I don't know what came over me," he said, his voice breaking. "You deserve so much better than a husband who loses control like that. Can you forgive me while I learn to love you the way you should be loved?" I forgave him because I believed marriage required patience and understanding, because I thought love meant accepting someone's flaws while helping them become better. I forgave him because admitting the truth that my new husband was capable of deliberate cruelty would mean acknowledging that my fairy tale wedding had been the beginning of a nightmare. But the honeymoon violence did not end with apologies. Over the next week, there were 3 more incidents. Robert shoved me into the bathroom door when I took too long getting ready for dinner, explaining that punctuality showed respect for his time. He dug his fingers into my arm hard enough to leave bruises when I laughed too loudly at something our waiter said, whispering that ladies should be more controlled in public. He slapped me for asking questions about his architectural projects when he seemed reluctant to discuss specific buildings he claimed to have designed. Each incident followed the same pattern. I would do something Robert considered inappropriate. He would hurt me physically. Then he would explain how my behavior had forced him to correct me, while promising to be more patient if I tried harder to meet his expectations. By the time we returned to Chicago, I had learned to anticipate his moods to modify my behavior based on his reactions to accept responsibility for his violence, even when logic told me none of it made sense. Our new apartment should have been a fresh start, but instead, it became a stage where Robert could perfect his performance as a devoted husband while systematically dismantling the independent woman he had married. He designated the spare room as my hobby space, filling it with art supplies while making clear that my real job would be supporting his career and maintaining our home. My illustrations, which had once been bold and confident, became timid pictures of flowers and children, safe subjects that would not provoke his criticism. The discovery that would eventually save my life came a month after our return from the honeymoon. I was organizing art supplies in the closet when I knocked over a wooden box I had brought from my old apartment, but forgotten about during the chaos of moving. Inside were treasures from my adolescence, report cards, movie ticket stubs, photographs of friends, and most importantly, my journal from high school and college. I opened it to a random page dated June 15, 1946, saw the best years of our lives tonight. Myrna Loy was incredible, so strong and elegant, taking care of everyone while never losing herself. That's what I want to be like someday. Strong enough to help others, but never forgetting who I am. I want to create art that helps people feel less alone in the world. Reading these words felt like meeting a stranger who shared my face. The confident girl who had written them seemed to belong to someone else entirely, someone who had dreams and opinions, who expected to be treated with respect, who would never apologize for taking up space in the world. This discovery was devastating because it showed me how much I had lost in just 6 months of marriage. But it was also hope because it proved I had once been strong. If I had been strong before, perhaps I could be strong again. Armed with memories of who I had been before Robert, I began testing the boundaries of his control with small acts of rebellion. I chose restaurants for our dinner dates instead of automatically accepting his preferences. I expressed opinions about books and movies, even when my views contradicted his. I wore dresses without asking his approval first and styled my hair in ways that pleased me rather than him. Each assertion of independence was met with escalating punishment. When I suggested Italian food instead of French, Robert's jaw tightened, and he spent the entire meal criticizing my selfishness in forcing him to eat cuisine he disliked. When I praised a novel he had dismissed as women's fiction, he tore the book from my hands and threw it in the garbage, explaining that intelligent wives trusted their husbands' superior judgment about literature. When I wore a blue dress he had never commented on, he told me it made me look cheap and desperate for attention from other men. "You're becoming difficult, Eleanor," he said after each correction. "Marriage is about becoming a team, about compromise. Why are you being so selfish lately? Don't you want us to be happy together?" The guilt was immediate and overwhelming. Of course I wanted our marriage to be happy. Of course I was being selfish by insisting on preferences that created conflict. I would apologize and promise to be more considerate, but the part of me that remembered being confident and independent refused to disappear completely. The physical violence intensified in direct response to my small rebellions. Robert slapped me for contradicting him about politics during dinner with his colleagues, then explained that wives who made their husbands look foolish in public deserved correction. He shoved me against the wall when I arrived home 20 minutes late from the grocery store, saying that wives who could not manage simple tasks needed to learn better time management. He grabbed my arm so tightly that his fingers left bruises shaped like fingerprints, always in places my clothing would hide always. While explaining that his love for me was so intense, it sometimes overwhelmed his gentleness. "I can't help myself when you push me like this," he would say, after hurting me, his voice breaking with apparent remorse. "You know how much I love you, Eleanor. Sometimes that love frightens me with its intensity. You have to help me by not provoking these reactions." I began keeping my old journal hidden in my art supplies, writing new entries late at night when Robert slept. The contrast between my teenage confidence and my current fear was stark. October 3rd, 1953. I don't recognize the person I've become. The girl who wrote in this journal believed she could change the world with her art. She had opinions and dreams and fire in her belly. What happened to her? When did I become someone who apologizes for existing? At work, I tried to maintain normalcy, but the stress was affecting my performance. I arrived early to apply makeup over bruises, invented explanations for stiff movements that betrayed hidden injuries, and struggled to concentrate on design projects that had once excited me. My illustrations lost their boldness, becoming safe imitations of work I had once created with passion and confidence. Mr. Henderson noticed the change, but attributed it to natural marriage adjustments. When I missed deadlines or seemed distracted during meetings, he would say kindly, "Take your time finding your rhythm, Eleanor. Marriage is a big change for a girl. You'll settle in soon enough." His patronizing kindness reflected society's assumption that my struggles were normal, even healthy signs that I was properly prioritizing my marital duties over individual ambitions. No one questioned whether a wife's increasing timidity might indicate something darker than natural feminine adjustment to married life. The crisis came in late October when I gathered courage to ask Robert about attending Martha's gallery opening. She had sent an invitation to our apartment, and I thought it might be something we could enjoy together. "I'd like to support her work," I said, carefully showing him the elegant invitation. "We could make an evening of it, dinner first, then the opening." Robert's reaction was swift and violent. He grabbed the invitation from my hands and tore it into pieces, then seized my shoulders and shook me until my teeth rattled and my vision blurred. "You don't need friends anymore." He snarled, his face inches from mine. "You have me. Isn't that enough? Are you saying our marriage isn't fulfilling enough to satisfy you?" I assured him frantically that he was everything I needed, that our marriage was perfect, that I had only thought the gallery opening might be something we could share. But the damage was done. He had made clear that my friendships were threats to our relationship, that maintaining connections to my pre-marriage life constituted betrayal. That night, I threw away Martha's torn invitation, along with several letters from other friends I had been too afraid to answer. In my journal, I wrote what felt like an obituary for the person I used to be. "I'm disappearing piece by piece. Every day there's less of me left. I used to laugh and create and believe I could make a difference in the world. Now I'm just someone who tries not to make him angry. How do I find my way back to who I was? Do I even remember who that person was anymore?" The isolation deepened systematically over the following months as Robert implemented increasingly strict controls over my daily life. He intercepted phone calls from Martha and other friends, explaining with charming regret that I was too busy with married life to maintain old relationships. He began arriving at my office, unexpectedly claiming to surprise me with lunch, while actually monitoring my interactions with colleagues. He criticized my work with growing frequency, suggesting I should quit Henderson and Associates to focus on preparing for the family we'll have soon. "You're wasting your talents on advertisements," he would say, his tone reasonable and caring. "Wouldn't it be more fulfilling to channel that creativity into making our home beautiful, into becoming the kind of mother our children will need?" The mention of children filled me with terror I could not articulate. The thought of bringing a baby into this situation, of watching Robert extend his control over someone even more vulnerable than I was, seemed like a trap that would make escape impossible forever. I had always wanted children, had dreamed of teaching them to draw and paint, of raising them to be confident and independent. Now that possibility felt like another weapon Robert could use against me. During this period, I made a discovery that shattered my remaining illusions about the man I had married. Robert had been claiming that his architectural firm was between major projects, but when I was asked to organize his papers for tax purposes, I found evidence that he had no architectural career at all. The portfolio of beautiful houses he had shown me during our courtship contained drawings copied from magazines with his name forged on plans created by other architects. The rejection letters I discovered told a story of consistent failure firms that had refused to hire him, clients who had fired him for incompetence, colleagues who had warned others about his volatile temperament and questionable qualifications. Robert was not the successful professional he had claimed to be. He was a man living off savings from various construction jobs, building an elaborate fiction to attract women who would be impressed by creativity and financial stability. I was his target, carefully selected and systematically deceived from our first meeting. This knowledge was both liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it confirmed that my instincts had been correct. There had been something false about his professional presentations, something that did not add up about his supposed achievements. Terrifying because it revealed the depth of his deception and raised questions about what else he had lied about. But confronting him would mean admitting I had searched through his private papers, and I had learned that challenging Robert about anything led to violence. So I kept this knowledge secret, adding it to the growing collection of dangerous truths I carried alone. The physical abuse became more frequent and strategic during this period. Robert had learned to read my moods with predatory accuracy, anticipating rebellions before I had fully formed them in my own mind. A look of longing when I passed my old office building would earn a painful pinch. A sigh when reading about art exhibitions in the newspaper would result in the paper being confiscated and destroyed. "You're thinking about your old life again," he would say with terrifying perceptiveness. "Why can't you be satisfied with what we have? Why do you always want something more?" My journal entries grew increasingly desperate. December 15th, 1953. He's killing me slowly, piece by piece. I used to be someone who had opinions, who laughed at inappropriate jokes, who stayed up all night reading books that changed how I saw the world. Now I'm just someone who anticipates his reactions and modifies her behavior to avoid punishment. I'm becoming invisible even to myself. At work, my performance continued declining as fear and isolation took their toll. I would stare out windows for long periods, lose track of conversations, jump at sudden sounds that reminded me of Robert's footsteps. My colleagues began noticing whispered conversations that stopped when I entered rooms, concerned glances when they thought I was not looking, offers of help I was too frightened to accept. The breakthrough came in early January 1954 when Martha appeared at my office on a snowy afternoon. She had driven down from Milwaukee despite the dangerous weather, her face set with determination that reminded me of our art school days when she championed unpopular causes. "I haven't heard from you in months, Eleanor," she said without preamble, studying my face with an artist's eye for revealing details. "Robert keeps saying you're busy adjusting to married life, but you look thin, exhausted. Are you eating enough? Are you sleeping?" I wanted desperately to tell her everything, to collapse into her arms and confess my shame, my terror, my complete loss of the person I used to be. The words pressed against my throat like caged birds desperate for freedom. But I was too afraid of Robert's retaliation to speak honestly. Instead, I smiled brightly and lied about being perfectly happy about marriage suiting me wonderfully, about being too absorbed in domestic bliss to maintain old friendships. The words tasted like poison in my mouth, but they seemed safer than the truth. Martha was not convinced by my performance. "Eleanor, I'm genuinely worried about you," she said, leaning forward with concern. "You haven't answered my letters, you missed my birthday completely, and frankly, you look like you've seen a ghost. What's really happening in your life? Before I could formulate another lie, Mr. Henderson appeared in my office doorway with an apologetic expression. "Eleanor, I'm sorry to interrupt, but your husband called. He says you have a dentist appointment and need to leave immediately." I had not scheduled any dentist appointment. Robert was checking up on me, ensuring I did not spend unauthorized time with friends who might ask uncomfortable questions or offer unwanted support. The realization was both humiliating and enlightening. He did not trust me enough to have a simple conversation without his supervision. "I should go," I said to Martha, gathering my coat with hands that trembled visibly. "Robert worries when I'm late for appointments." Martha watched with growing alarm as I rushed through hurried goodbyes, promising to write soon while knowing I would not be allowed to keep that promise. As I headed toward the elevator, I heard her call after me. "Eleanor, if you need anything at all, you know where to find me." The ride home was a blur of anxiety and self-recrimination. How had I allowed my life to become so small, so controlled, so utterly dependent on one man's approval? The confident woman Martha had known in art school would not recognize the frightened creature I had become. At home, Robert was waiting with dinner prepared and candles lit, playing the role of the devoted husband who had simply been concerned about his wife's well-being. "I hope you don't mind that I called your office," he said, his voice warm with false affection. "I just wanted to make sure you got home safely. The roads are so icy tonight." But his eyes held an unmistakable warning. He knew exactly what I had been doing, whom I had been talking to, and how close I had come to breaking the carefully constructed silence that protected his secrets. This would not be permitted to happen again. The discovery that changed everything came on a February morning when Chicago was locked in winter's most brutal grip. Robert had been drinking heavily for weeks, unemployed and increasingly volatile, finding fault with everything I did and punishing me for infractions both real and imagined. I was cleaning the basement storage room, a task he had assigned to keep me busy and isolated, when I made the find that would reveal the true scope of my danger. Behind the old water heater, in a space I had never noticed before, I found a wooden crate that clearly did not belong to either of us. The wood was stained and aged as if it had been hidden there long before we moved into the apartment. My hands shook as I pried off the lid, not knowing that I was about to discover evidence of multiple murders. Inside were professional photographs, dozens of them black and white portraits that made my blood turn to ice. Beautiful women with black eyes, split lips, bandaged arms. Women who looked like me, who had the same expression of confused pain I had been seeing in my own mirror for months. Each photograph was carefully dated and labeled: Susan Parker, March 1951, Margaret Walsh, August 1950, Patricia Collins, November 1949. But what lay beneath the photographs was even more terrifying. A leather journal filled with Robert's meticulous handwriting, not love letters or architectural notes, but clinical observations about techniques for training, women detailed records of which methods worked most effectively, and cold calculations about how far he could push before risking exposure or needing to terminate the relationship. The entries read like a scientist's research notes. March 15th, 1951. Susan finally stopped questioning my decisions after I broke her rib. The physical correction was more effective than psychological pressure alone. She has become properly submissive, though I may need to escalate if she shows further signs of independent thinking. July 2nd, 1951, had to end the situation with Susan. She became unstable, threatening to contact police despite understanding the consequences. Fortunately, her accident on the stairs appeared convincing to investigators. No further complications expected. November 18th, 1952. Met Eleanor Mills today at Miller's Coffee House. Mixed heritage could present challenges, but she displays perfect combination of intelligence and insecurity. Her desire for love makes her easier to manipulate than Susan was. This should proceed more smoothly. I sat on the cold basement floor, reading entry after entry, each one more horrifying than the last. Robert had not chosen me because he fell in love at first sight. He had selected me like a predator, choosing prey, studying my vulnerabilities, and crafting his approach to exploit them systematically. Every romantic gesture, every shared confidence, every moment I had believed showed genuine connection had been calculated. Manipulation, designed to transform me into the perfect victim. The photographs were not trophies, they were documentation. Proof of his success in systematically destroying women who had once been strong, independent, complete human beings. Susan's progression through the pictures showed her transformation from confident young woman to hollow-eyed victim, and her final photograph was dated just days before the journal entry describing her accident. There were more women represented in the collection, more photographs documenting the stages of their destruction, more detailed records of psychological and physical techniques Robert had refined through years of practice. He was not simply an abuser. He was a serial killer who had turned the murder of women into a science, documenting his methods like a researcher publishing experimental findings. The basement suddenly felt like a tomb. The house above me, a carefully constructed trap designed by someone who had spent years perfecting the art of imprisonment and murder. Everything about our relationship had been orchestrated according to patterns he had tested and refined with previous victims. With trembling hands, I used the small camera I kept for work to photograph each page of Robert's journal, each picture of his victims. The evidence was too important to leave hidden, too damning to risk losing if Robert discovered I had found his collection. I carefully returned everything to its exact position, but I kept the exposed film hidden in my art supplies, wrapped in cloth, and buried beneath sketches I would never show him. This discovery clarified everything with devastating precision. I was not crazy weak or deserving of punishment. I was the latest target of a predator who had spent years perfecting methods for isolating, tormenting, and ultimately murdering women. The confusion and self-doubt that had plagued me for months lifted as I finally understood what I was fighting: not a troubled husband who might improve with patience and love, but a calculating killer who viewed my death as the inevitable conclusion to his current project. But understanding Robert's true nature also meant understanding that I was in immediate mortal danger. The journal's pattern was clear when victims became too difficult to control when they threatened exposure or attempted escape. Robert eliminated them and moved on to new targets. The escalating violence I had been experiencing was not random cruelty. It was the methodical progression toward murder that he had documented in previous cases. For the first time in months, my mind felt completely clear. The fog of confusion and self-blame that had clouded my thinking disappeared as I finally grasped the full scope of what I was dealing with. Robert had never loved me. I was not his wife. I was his research subject, his current experiment in the systematic destruction of female independence. If I was going to survive, I would need to become as calculating and strategic as he was. I would need to study his methods and find their weaknesses, document evidence of his crimes, and plan my escape with the same methodical precision he applied to murder. The confident girl who had once written about conquering the world was still alive somewhere inside me. It was time to let her fight for both our lives. Knowledge of Robert's true nature should have empowered me, but instead, it created new forms of terror. Now, I understood exactly what he was capable of, but I remained trapped in his web with no clear path to safety. He had isolated me so completely that I had nowhere to run, no one who would believe my story, and no resources of my own to support an escape attempt. Worse, Robert's predatory instincts sensed the change in me long before I was ready to act on my knowledge. Perhaps it was the way I no longer automatically flinched when he raised his voice, or how I had stopped apologizing for imaginary mistakes. Maybe it was something as subtle as the way I held my shoulders when he entered a room, no longer reflexively shrinking, to make myself less threatening to his ego. Whatever he detected, his response was swift and brutal. The psychological pressure intensified dramatically, constant interrogation about my activities, thorough inspection of my belongings, monitoring of every phone call and piece of mail that entered our apartment. He began appearing at my office without warning, claiming to surprise me with lunch, while actually ensuring I was not building relationships that might threaten his control. "You're different lately," he said one evening, cornering me in the kitchen with that predatory stillness I had learned to recognize as a prelude to violence. "Distant, like you're thinking about things you shouldn't be thinking about. What are you plotting, Eleanor?" The beating that followed was the worst I had experienced, not random violence born of momentary rage, but calculated punishment designed to break whatever resistance he sensed building inside me. Robert had clearly studied anatomy, understanding exactly where to inflict maximum pain without leaving marks visible to others. As I lay curled on the bathroom floor afterward, struggling to breathe around damaged ribs, I realized this was how Susan Parker had felt before her fatal accident. But something fundamental had shifted in me since discovering his journal. The pain was excruciating, but knowing it was part of a documented pattern somehow made it bearable. He was following a script he had written and perfected through previous murders, but I was no longer reading from it blindly. Every blow reinforced my determination to survive him, to become the woman who broke his pattern instead of being destroyed by it. I began my own documentation project, using the camera techniques I had learned for work to photograph fresh bruises, recording dates, and descriptions of attacks in a coded journal hidden inside a hollowed-out art book. At work, I slowly began rebuilding connections with colleagues, engaging in casual conversations that had nothing to do with my marriage, but everything to do with reestablishing my identity as someone who existed independently of Robert's control. When Martha called my office, expressing concern instead of making the usual excuses, I took the enormous risk of agreeing to meet her for coffee. I knew Robert would likely discover this meeting, but I desperately needed to begin building bridges back to the world of people who remembered who I had been before I became his victim. "Eleanor, my God!" Martha whispered when she saw me at the small cafe we had chosen. Despite my careful application of makeup, the weight loss and haunted expression were unmistakable to someone who had known me when I was whole. "What's happening to you? You look like you haven't slept properly in months." I could not tell her everything, not yet, not in public, especially when I was uncertain how extensive Robert's surveillance might be. But I allowed her to see enough truth to plant seeds of understanding that might grow into action if something happened to me. "Things are not what they appear to be," I said, carefully choosing words that might sound innocent to an observer, but would carry weight with someone who knew me well. "If something happens to me, Martha, I need you to look into Robert's background. Look for information about a woman named Susan Parker who died in an accident involving stairs." Martha gripped my hand across the table, her artist's intuition filling in gaps I could not speak aloud. "Eleanor, you're frightening me. What do you mean, if something happens? Are you in immediate physical danger?" Before I could answer, Robert materialized beside our table, like a predator emerging from shadows. I had not heard him enter the cafe, had not seen him following me from work. His smile was charming, his manner perfectly cordial, as he greeted Martha and suggested I needed to come home because I had been feeling unwell lately. "Eleanor's been experiencing severe headaches," he told Martha smoothly, his hand settling on my shoulder with just enough pressure to remind me of his power over my life. "Her doctor recommended more rest and less social stimulation until she recovers." The ride home was conducted in silence that felt heavier than shouting. Robert's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and I could feel his rage building like steam in a pressure cooker. At home, he exploded with the kind of controlled fury that was more terrifying than wild anger, because it demonstrated how much careful thought he invested in causing pain. "You think you can involve your pathetic friends in our private business?" he said, his voice deadly quiet as he backed me against the living room wall. You think I don't understand exactly what you're doing, dropping hints and planting suspicions in people who could never comprehend what we share together. The punishment that followed was systematic and prolonged, designed not merely to cause pain, but to reinforce lessons I was supposed to have learned about the consequences of defiance. As he hurt me methodically, he talked about Susan Parker, about how she had tried to involve others in their relationship, about how that strategy had not worked out favorably for her in the end. Accidents happen so easily to women who don't understand boundaries, he murmured as I struggled to breathe around the agony in my ribs. Especially women who try to turn private matters into public spectacles. Susan learned that lesson, though, unfortunately, it came too late to benefit her. His critical mistake was mentioning Susan by name, confirming what I had read in his journal, and validating my worst fears about what happened to women who attempted to escape his control. He had intended to terrorize me into complete submission, but instead, he had given me the final piece of evidence I needed to understand that this was not merely about controlling me. It was about preparing to kill me when I became too troublesome to manage through conventional violence. As I lay in the darkness that night, listening to him sleep peacefully beside me, like a man with no conscience to disturb his rest, I began planning my escape with the same methodical precision he applied to murder. I could not save Susan Parker, or Margaret Walsh, or Patricia Collins, but I could ensure their deaths served a purpose by helping me survive to expose the truth about Robert Sullivan. The final confrontation arrived on a March evening when winter was beginning its reluctant retreat from Chicago, though our apartment remained as cold as a mortuary. Robert had been drinking steadily since afternoon, not the social consumption of his early pretenses, but the methodical intake of a man building courage for a task he had been planning meticulously. The trigger was absurdly trivial, as it always was with predators who required justification for their actions. The telephone rang during dinner preparation, Martha calling to check on me after our cafe meeting several days earlier. I should have ignored it, should have understood that any contact with the outside world would be interpreted as betrayal, requiring permanent correction. I can't talk long, I whispered into the receiver, watching the doorway for signs of Robert's approach. But I wanted you to know that your concern means more than you realize. Thank you for caring when others have given up on me. I hung up quickly, my heart hammering as I heard his footsteps on the stairs. When he appeared in the kitchen doorway, his face carried that expression of deadly calm I had learned to fear more than screaming rage. This was not anger. This was decision, the cold resolve of a man who had concluded that a problem required permanent solution. Who was that? He asked, though we both understood he had been monitoring the conversation from the hallway. Wrong number, I lied, turning back to the stove with hands that shook despite my efforts to appear casual and unconcerned. Eleanor. His voice carried a tone I had never heard before, quiet and final as the closing of a coffin lid. We both know that's completely untrue. We both know exactly who that was and what she wants from you. He moved closer with measured steps, not with the explosive energy of his usual violence, but with the calculated pace of someone executing a plan he had thought through carefully. This was the moment I had been dreading since discovering his journal, the escalation that had claimed Susan Parker and the others who had tried to resist his ultimate control. She's going to cause serious problems for us. He continued, his hands hanging loosely at his sides in a way that was more menacing than raised fists. Friends like that never understand what marriage really means. They fill wives' heads with dangerous ideas about independence, about rights they imagine they deserve. I could see him calculating distance and angles, choosing his approach, deciding how to position my body so that whatever happened next would appear accidental to investigators. The basement stairs where he kept his documentation were too far away, but there were other options: the gas range behind me, the knife block on the counter, the heavy ceramic dishes that could cause fatal head trauma if applied with sufficient force. But something had changed fundamentally in me during the weeks since I had uncovered his true nature. The woman who had cowered and apologized for months was gone, replaced by someone who understood that survival required fighting back with everything I possessed. The confident teenager who had once written about conquering the world was not dead. She had been gathering strength for this exact moment. No. I said the word, emerging steadier than I had expected it would. I will not let you hurt me anymore. For several seconds, he appeared genuinely startled. In all his careful planning, in all his documentation of successful techniques for destroying women, he had not accounted for the possibility that his intended victim might refuse to cooperate with her own murder. "What did you just say to me?" he asked, his voice carrying more curiosity than immediate threat, as if I were a laboratory specimen that had just exhibited completely unexpected behavior. I said no. I turned to face him directly, my back against the stove, my hands steady despite the terror flooding my nervous system. No more beatings, no more threats, no more pretending that what you do to me has anything to do with love or marriage. His face contorted with something between murderous rage and scientific fascination. You think you can simply decide to stop being my wife? You think you have the power to walk away from everything we've built together? We have not built anything together, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word I spoke. You have been destroying me piece by piece, exactly the way you destroyed Susan Parker and Margaret Walsh and Patricia Collins and all the others. But I found your journal, Robert. I know exactly what you are. The mention of his documentation struck him like a physical blow. His carefully maintained control cracked, visibly revealing the panic that lived underneath his predatory composure. You went through my private possessions. You had absolutely no right to. I had every right to discover that I married a serial killer. The word hung between us like a blade, sharp and unforgivable, and absolutely true. Robert's mask fell away completely for the first time since I had known him, revealing the creature that had been hiding underneath his charm and manipulation. This was his authentic self, not the sophisticated architect he had pretended to be, not the passionate husband he had performed, but a killer who had refined the murder of women into artistic expression. He lunged for me with the swift brutality of a striking snake, but I was already moving toward the cast-iron skillet I had been using to prepare dinner. The heavy pan connected with his temple in a swing that carried all my suppressed rage, all my grief for the woman I had been before he tried to erase her, all my determination to survive when so many others had not. He staggered backward, blood streaming from his scalp, his expression more shocked than pained. In all his years of perfecting violence against women, he had never been on the receiving end of someone fighting back with genuine intent to win rather than merely survive. You cannot do this to me, he gasped, pressing his hand against his bleeding head while staring at me with disbelief. You need me to exist. You are nothing without my guidance. No one will ever believe your ridiculous accusations. But I was already reaching for the telephone, dialing the number I had memorized weeks earlier when I first began planning for this moment. As the operator connected me to police dispatch, Robert made one final desperate lunge toward me, but his coordination was compromised by the head injury, and his movements were clumsy and predictable. The second blow from the skillet sent him crashing into the kitchen table unconscious before his body hit the linoleum floor. I stood over him, shaking with adrenaline and terror, and something that felt remarkably like triumph as I heard my own voice speaking into the telephone with surprising steadiness and clarity. I need to report a domestic violence incident and attempted murder, I said, providing our address to the dispatcher with precise diction. My husband has been systematically abusing me for months, and I have just discovered physical evidence that he has murdered multiple women. He attempted to kill me tonight, but I defended myself successfully. The words felt surreal emerging from my mouth, as if I were describing someone else's experience rather than my own. But they were completely accurate, every single syllable, and speaking them aloud felt like breaking chains I had been carrying for so long I had forgotten what freedom weighed. When police officers arrived 8 minutes later, they found me sitting calmly in the living room with Robert's leather journal open on my lap. The photographs of his victims spread across the coffee table, like evidence in a trial that had been years in preparation. Robert remained unconscious in the kitchen, bleeding steadily onto the same floor that had absorbed so much of my own blood during our marriage. "Ma'am, do you require medical attention?" The first officer asked, his voice professionally compassionate as he assessed my appearance, the fading bruises, the dramatic weight loss, the hollow-eyed exhaustion of someone who had been fighting for survival longer than any human being should have to endure. "Not anymore," I replied, and meant it with every fiber of my being. The investigation that followed my call to police revealed the true scope of Robert's crimes and transformed our private nightmare into a public reckoning that dominated Chicago headlines for months. The basement of our apartment building yielded evidence of at least 7 murders spanning nearly a decade, each death carefully documented in journals, each victim systematically destroyed, according to Robert's evolving experimental methodology. Detective James Morrison, the lead investigator assigned to the case, explained to me how the evidence I had gathered made prosecution possible. "Without your photographs of the journal entries and victim documentation, Mrs. Sullivan, we might never have connected these deaths as related crimes," he said during one of our many interviews. "Most were ruled accidents or suicides at the time. Your husband was very careful to make them appear unrelated. Susan Parker had been 23 when she died, a secretary at a downtown law firm who had been planning to leave Robert when she suffered her fatal fall down apartment stairs. The coroner had noted injuries consistent with being pushed, but without additional evidence. Her death was classified as accidental. Margaret Walsh, an elementary school teacher, had supposedly committed suicide by gas poisoning after neighbors reported hearing violent arguments from her apartment. Patricia Collins had drowned in Lake Michigan during what Robert claimed was a romantic midnight walk, though witnesses later recalled seeing him alone on the pier where her body was discovered. Each case followed the same pattern I had experienced: an intense romantic courtship, rapid isolation from friends and family, escalating physical and psychological abuse, then elimination when the victim became too difficult to control or threatened to expose his behavior. Robert had been operating as a serial killer for nearly 10 years, refining his techniques through trial and error, while documenting his methods like a scientist conducting research. My testimony became the foundation of a prosecution case that would establish new legal precedents for domestic violence charges in Illinois. The detailed documentation I had managed to collect: photographs of my injuries, recorded dates of attacks, copies of Robert's own journal entries, provided prosecutors with evidence that could not be dismissed as misunderstanding or marital discord. This was not a crime of passion. District Attorney Helen Rodriguez explained to reporters covering the trial. This was systematic, premeditated murder disguised as marriage. Mr. Sullivan turned the destruction of women into a calculated science, and only Mrs. Sullivan's courage in fighting back prevented him from claiming another victim. Robert survived his head injuries, but remained unconscious for nearly 3 weeks, giving investigators time to build their case without interference from his considerable skills at manipulation and deception. When he finally regained consciousness, neurological damage from the trauma had significantly impaired his cognitive functions, ending forever his ability to be the smooth predator who had claimed so many lives. During the trial, 3 additional women came forward with stories of relationships with Robert that had followed the same pattern documented in his journals. They had escaped before he escalated to murder, but their testimony confirmed that I had not been his only target during our marriage. He had been actively cultivating other potential victims, even while systematically preparing to kill me. Martha attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row where I could see her supportive face during the most difficult testimony. "I should have done more when I saw how you were changing," she told me one evening as we reviewed my testimony for the following day. I should have insisted on helping instead of accepting your explanations about being happy. You did exactly what you should have done, I assured her. You stayed concerned, you kept reaching out, and you gave me someone to call when I finally found the courage to ask for help. That made all the difference. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on 7 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. Robert was sentenced to life imprisonment without possibility of parole, though his brain damage meant he would spend his remaining years in the prison medical facility, no longer capable of the calculated violence that had defined his adult existence. I testified at his sentencing hearing, not seeking revenge, but pursuing closure for myself and the women whose voices had been permanently silenced by his actions. Robert Sullivan approached the murder of women as if it were an academic discipline. I told the court, my voice steady despite the emotional weight of the moment. He studied our vulnerabilities, documented our suffering, and perfected techniques for erasing us from existence. But he made one critical error in his research. He underestimated our capacity to survive, to fight back, and to ensure that his victims' stories would finally be told. 23 years have passed since that March evening when I chose to fight for my life, instead of accepting death, and the woman writing these words today would be unrecognizable to the terrified bride who once apologized for bleeding on her own kitchen floor. I am now 48 years old with silver threading through hair I wear short and practical. My hands marked by decades of creating art that transforms pain into hope for others walking similar paths. The Eleanor Mills Gallery opened its doors in downtown Chicago in 1965, occupying 3 floors of a converted warehouse where natural light streams through enormous windows onto artwork that tells difficult truths about survival and human resilience. We specialize in exhibitions by women artists whose creative work addresses themes of overcoming adversity, creating a space where visitors can see themselves reflected in images that acknowledge suffering but celebrate the human capacity to transcend it. The gallery has become a destination for women seeking evidence that survival after trauma is not only possible, but can lead to lives of meaning and purpose. Many of the artists whose work we display are survivors themselves, women who have channeled experiences of domestic violence, sexual assault, discrimination, and other forms of systematic oppression into visual statements that refuse to allow suffering to remain invisible or unaddressed. Martha remained my closest friend and business partner until her death from cancer in 1974, never allowing me to forget the confident young woman I had been before Robert, always reminding me of dreams I had temporarily abandoned, but could still reclaim and expand. She was the person who suggested I write about my experience leading to the memoir that became both a bestseller and a practical resource guide for other women trapped in abusive situations. Breaking the Pattern. How I Survived a Serial Killer's Marriage was published by Doubleday in 1968 and has since been translated into 18 languages. Writing it required reliving those memories through careful documentation, which proved almost as traumatic as experiencing them originally. But the thousands of letters I have received from women who found strength and practical guidance in my story have validated every difficult sentence. The book led to speaking engagements across the United States and Canada, where I address audiences of law enforcement officers, social workers, counselors, judges, and survivors themselves. I always begin these presentations with the same message. Domestic violence is not about love gone wrong or passion out of control. It is about power domination and the systematic destruction of another human being's autonomy and independence. Understanding this distinction is the first step toward effective prevention, intervention, and healing. In 1971, I received a letter that would provide the final piece of understanding I needed to move completely beyond Robert's psychological shadow. It came from Catherine Sullivan Morrison, Robert's younger half-sister, whom I had never met during our marriage. She had been following news coverage of the trial and its aftermath through newspaper accounts, and she possessed information she believed I deserved to know. We arranged to meet at a small cafe near the gallery, and Catherine arrived clutching a manila envelope, as if it contained something that might explode if handled carelessly. In many ways, it did contain explosive information documents that explained not only what Robert had become, but precisely how he had been created through systematic childhood trauma. Robert was not my full brother. She began, her voice trembling with the weight of family secrets she had carried alone for decades. He was adopted into our family when I was 7 years old, but I never knew the complete circumstances until our mother died last year, and I discovered these papers among her personal effects. The documents revealed that Robert had been removed from his biological family at age 5 due to severe physical and sexual abuse that had already caused permanent psychological damage. His birth father, Thomas Sullivan, had been a violent alcoholic who beat Robert's mother Mary to death when Robert was 4 years old, forcing the boy to watch her die slowly from internal injuries over several hours, while Thomas prevented her from seeking medical help. The psychological evaluation from when he was placed in foster care. Catherine continued handing me a yellowed psychiatric report that felt like holding a piece of historical evidence, describes a child who was already exhibiting what they called learned patterns of violence toward women and compulsive documentation behaviors. The examining psychiatrist wrote that without intensive therapeutic intervention, Robert would almost certainly repeat the cycle of violence he had witnessed and experienced, likely with increasing sophistication as he matured. I read the report with a mixture of fascination and horror, finally understanding that Robert had not been born a monster, but had been systematically created by trauma and neglect that went unaddressed by every system meant to protect children. The calculated nature of his adult crimes, his methodical documentation of abuse techniques, even his specific targeting of independent women, all of it could be traced directly to lessons learned in childhood about power control and the fundamental expendability of female life. "I want to be absolutely clear," Catherine said, recognizing the complexity of what she was revealing, "that I am not making excuses for what he did to you or to those other women. Nothing justifies murder regardless of childhood trauma. But I thought you should understand that you were not chosen randomly or because of any weakness on your part. You were targeted by someone who had been trained from birth to see women as objects to be controlled and ultimately destroyed when they became inconvenient." This revelation was simultaneously devastating and liberating. Devastating because it illuminated how cycles of violence perpetuate themselves across generations, creating new predators from the wreckage of previous crimes and failures of social intervention. Liberating because it confirmed absolutely that my survival was not merely personal victory. It was political and social resistance to patterns that had been decades in the making. I incorporated Robert's childhood history into my advocacy work, helping develop more effective resources for identifying and treating children who display early warning signs of violent behavior patterns. Understanding the origins of abuse has made me significantly more effective at helping women recognize and escape dangerous situations, and has also informed prevention programs aimed at interrupting these cycles before they claim new victims. The Eleanor Mills Foundation, which I established in 1972, provides grants to women artists whose work addresses themes of empowerment and social justice, but it also funds research into the childhood developmental roots of domestic violence and supports early intervention programs for at-risk families. We have learned that prevention requires addressing the conditions that create predators like Robert, not merely responding after they have already begun killing. My personal life has been rich and fulfilling in ways I never imagined possible during those dark months when I believed I might not survive to see another spring. I chose never to remarry, not from fear of men or relationships, but because I discovered genuine satisfaction in my independence and in work that grew organically from my experiences of survival and recovery. In 1976, I began a partnership with David Chen, a social worker whose family had known mine during my childhood in Milwaukee. David's professional commitment to healing trauma survivors initially drew me to him, But it was his understanding that my independence represented strength rather than threat that made our relationship sustainable and nurturing. We have been together for 7 years now, and he has become not only my companion, but my collaborator in much of the Foundation's work with families affected by domestic violence. David often asks how I have managed to transform such devastating trauma into work that helps others heal and survive, and my answer is always the same: I had no alternative. The only option other than transformation was remaining forever defined by Robert's violence, allowing him to continue destroying me, even from his prison cell where he will die. Choosing to use my survival as foundation for helping others was the ultimate rejection of everything he tried to make me believe about my worth as a human being. The gallery continues to thrive and expand, showcasing art that challenges comfortable assumptions about women's experiences and capabilities while providing practical resources for women seeking to escape dangerous situations. Last month, we hosted an exhibition titled Invisible No More, featuring works by survivors of various forms of violence who have channeled their healing journeys into visual statements of resistance, hope, and determination. But perhaps my greatest achievement remains both simple and profound. I survived. I refused to become another entry in a killer's research journal, another photograph in a box of documented victims, another woman whose story ended with unexplained tragedy that was quietly forgotten. I chose to live, to create, to transform my pain into something that could illuminate safer paths for others walking through similar darkness. Sometimes, young women visit the gallery drawn by stories they have heard about the woman who survived the pattern killer and built something meaningful from the wreckage of her marriage. They ask how I recognized the danger in time to save myself, how I found courage when hope seemed impossible, how I built a life worth living from the ruins of everything I had once believed about love and partnership. I tell them about documentation, the importance of photographing injuries, recording dates, and details of abuse, gathering evidence that cannot be dismissed as misunderstanding or exaggeration. I tell them about the power of maintaining connections with people who remember who you were before someone began trying to erase you. I tell them about the necessity of fighting back when fighting becomes the only alternative to death. Most importantly, I tell them what I learned that night when I finally refused to cooperate with my own destruction. We are all stronger than we know, stronger than our abusers believe, stronger than the systems that fail to protect us adequately. The confident teenager who once wrote, "You are stronger than you know," in her journal was absolutely correct. I was stronger than Robert calculated, stronger than I understood, and certainly stronger than a society that would have preferred I disappear quietly rather than expose ugly truths about domestic violence in respectable marriages. As I complete these final words, spring is returning to Chicago once again, and from my gallery office, I can see the lake where Patricia Collins died, the neighborhood where Susan Parker lived, the streets where so many women have walked in fear and isolation. But I can also see the community center where support groups meet weekly, the courthouse where stronger laws protecting domestic violence survivors are now enforced, and the schools where children learn that violence is never acceptable in relationships. Change is slow and often imperfect, but it is absolutely real and measurable. The woman who nearly died in a kitchen in 1954 has lived to see domestic violence transformed from a private shame that women endured in silence into a public issue that society acknowledges and addresses, however inadequately at times. We survive, we heal, we refuse to be forgotten or erased. And sometimes, when we are fortunate and determined, we transform our survival into tools that help ensure other women will not have to endure what we endured. The silver-haired woman writing these words would be completely unrecognizable to the terrified young bride who once apologized for bleeding on her own kitchen floor. But she would be instantly familiar to the confident teenager who wrote in her journal about using art to change the world and help people feel less alone. That girl grew up, survived hell, and built something beautiful and useful from the ashes of almost being destroyed. She kept every promise she made to herself, and in doing so, She honored the memory of all the women who did not survive, whose stories ended in silence, but whose deaths gave profound meaning to her escape and recovery. We are stronger than we know. And sometimes, when we are tested beyond what seems humanly endurable, we discover exactly how strong that really is.